Welcome to today's podcast. We're discussing Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, The Message. This book is framed as a letter to his former students at Howard University, where he reflects on the power of writing and storytelling, especially when confronting systems of dominance, power, and oppression. Coates is a renowned writer, known for his deeply personal and insightful works like Between the World and Me. The Message feels like a continuation of those conversations, but with a more focused lens on the craft of writing itself. It's about how personal experiences shape our understanding of the world and how writing can be a tool to make sense of those experiences, but also to challenge dominant narratives. Coates repeatedly stresses the importance of clarity and truth in writing, urging writers to meticulously observe, research, and use language intentionally. He believes that especially when confronting complex issues like racism and colonialism, writers have a responsibility to be precise and thorough. He describes the biased body of work created to justify the oppression of black people. This corpus of historical accounts, scientific studies, and even seemingly innocuous cultural representations all work together to dehumanize black people and justify their exploitation. He connects this to other forms of oppression, such as the historical subjugation of peasants in Europe, showing how similar tactics of dehumanization were used to justify those systems as well. He advocates for a more critical form of education, one that doesn't shy away from difficult topics and encourages students to challenge existing power structures. Challenging existing structures is a central theme in the book. It comes up most prominently in his discussion of Israel and Palestine. He draws parallels between Zionism and other forms of colonialism. He talks about the use of language and storytelling to justify the mass displacement of indigenous people. He's critical of the push to silence dissenting voices, whether it's through book bans, curriculum censorship, or the intimidation of journalists and activists. Ultimately, the message is a call to action. He's urging his readers, especially young writers, to be critical thinkers, to challenge dominant narratives, to use their voices to fight for a more just and equitable world. He reminds us that writing isn't just about putting words on a page. It's about engaging with the world. It's about seeking truth. And most importantly, it's about using our words to illuminate and transform the world around us. So let's dive into today's podcast. As always, please share, like, and subscribe.
Wow, we're diving into some heavy stuff today.
Yeah.
All about language and race and like the weight of oppression.
Yeah.
And I gotta say, I'm hooked. The way this author ties their own story into this bigger picture, I mean, how do childhood rhymes lead to unpacking like systemic injustice?
Right. It's amazing, actually, how the author begins with something so simple as a love for language.
Yeah.
It's like they're saying, look, even in the most basic way we communicate, we can find really profound things.
Totally.
Have you ever, really gotten lost in how something's written? Like those times when the words just, I don't know, have this certain magic to them.
You mean the way they make you feel something?
Yeah.
It's not just the information itself, right?
Exactly.
All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into some really fascinating ideas about race and storytelling. We're looking at The Message, a collection of excerpts, kind of like snapshots from the author's life.
And it's all about language, race, how those two things connect to power.
And what's so fascinating is it's not just, some dry analysis. The author weaves in all these personal stories.
Which makes it so much more engaging. You really get pulled into his journey with language, which, by the way, starts early. Like, we're talking baby early.
He talks about being completely captivated by music, spoken word. He even mentions The Last Poets.
That incredible spoken word group.
I like that.
Right. And the author talks about being completely mesmerized by the sounds, even as a baby.
So that early immersion in such potent language, it seems like it really had a lasting impact.
Absolutely. They describe words as like a kind of enchantment.
Suggesting they hold a power beyond just, basic communication.
Exactly. It's like words have this ability to shape our whole understanding of the world.
To reveal things, challenge us.
Yes.
And he says that as a baby, he'd cry until his dad played them. Like he was just hardwired for this kind of powerful language.
Right. And it really spans like his childhood all the way to reflections on these trips he takes later to Dakar and Palestine.
Exactly. And it's kind of amazing how he ties it all together.
It is.
It's like from Baltimore to Dakar.
Yeah.
What's the through line?
And you can tell right from the beginning, this guy, he's captivated by language, stories from day one.
You can totally see how that foundation, that love of language, shapes his whole worldview. Like, it's not just about the words themselves, it's about the power those words have, right?
Totally. And he makes this point that for him, there's no real distinction between like high art, low art, whatever that even means, a Shakespeare sonnet, a Killer Cool G rap, a verse. It's all about the power of language to transport us, to make us feel. It's incredible. And it wasn't just music. He talks about this poem, The Duel, from one of his childhood books.
He wasn't just enjoying the rhyme and rhythm, though. It sparked this deeper curiosity. How do words, even simple ones, create these worlds in our minds, these emotions?
And that goes back to what we were saying about the feeling words evoke, right? Really.
Absolutely. And the author takes it a step further with this idea of haunting. Like, he doesn't just want you to read his words and think, well, that's interesting.
He wants them to stay with you, to get under your skin.
Exactly. He wants his words to spark reflection, even arguments, to haunt you long after you finish reading.
And that reminds me of something he talks about, this article he read about Darryl Stingley, the football player who suffered that terrible spinal injury.
That's a powerful example. Before reading that piece, he saw the world very simplistically. Good versus evil. Heroes and villains. Like something out of a comic book.
But that article, the way it was written, it just ripped off the rose-colored glasses.
Completely. And it's not just the horror of the injury itself, but like how the writer's words made them feel it, like they were right there.
Exactly. And that's the hook. The author isn't just telling a Stingley story. They're breaking down the writing, the way it brings you to that moment, to that vulnerability, you know? And it's not just the tragedy itself, but the article, it doesn't shy away from any of it, the violence, the rawness of it all. The author even says it shattered some illusion he'd been holding on to about good versus evil, you know.
Wow, it's like the world just got a whole lot more complicated.
Exactly. And this experience, it sparks this understanding of how important it is to look at the world's gray areas, not just the simple narratives.
He even connects it to Frederick Douglass, which seems like a bit of a jump, but when you really think about it.
Not at all. It's all about how freedom is portrayed. We often think of it as this triumphant, you know, reaching the mountaintop kind of thing. But the author, he focuses on how Douglass describes freedom as this leap into the unknown, full of uncertainty, maybe even danger.
So it's not just about breaking free. It's about everything that comes after. The uncertainty, the challenges.
Right, and that's what makes Douglass's story so powerful. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He tells it like it is. Even the hard parts.
It's like he's saying that real freedom, real liberation requires us to confront those complexities.
Exactly. And, you know, he draws this really interesting parallel to the #MeToo movement.
Okay, hold on. That's a jump. What's the through line?
It's about how powerful, detailed storytelling can make things visible. He argues that what made it so impactful was the sheer number of personal stories shared by survivors.
Right. Those stories, as difficult as they were to read, they forced people to pay attention.
They took this abstract concept, sexual assault, harassment, and made it impossible to ignore because suddenly you're confronted with real people, real lives impacted.
It's like you can't look away anymore.
And that, I think, is at the heart of what he's saying about storytelling. It has this power to illuminate, to make us see things we might otherwise turn away from. The author argues that whether it's a life-changing injury or power dynamics, impactful writing makes you feel those realities.
Yeah.
And that feeling, that understanding, that's what sparks change.
It's like they're saying, go beyond the headlines. These are real stories.
Precisely. And he even goes so far as to call it a political act, especially for people whose stories have historically been silenced, marginalized.
So it's about claiming that power, using your voice to tell your story, to demand to be heard.
Exactly. And to challenge the narratives that have been imposed on you, to create space for a more truthful, more nuanced understanding of the world. And then it gets even wilder. They connect their love of hip-hop with, get this, classic literature. They actually find parallels between Cool G rap lyrics and Shakespeare's Macbeth.
Wait, Coolty Rap and Shakespeare, those feel like totally different worlds.
I know, right? But the author says they both use language to, like, transport us, to reveal truths about power and ambition, even violence. It's about looking for these deeper connections.
So, like, don't get caught up in labels.
Exactly. And this all goes back to the author's upbringing, being immersed in Black literature and art, not just as entertainment, but as a lens to view the world.
Okay, so they're coming from a place of this, like, lived experience, having all these forms of expression woven into, like, their understanding of the world.
Yeah, yes.
It forced him, and I think by extension us, the readers, to confront how complex the world really is.
And that's the thing about language, right? It can illuminate these hard truths, these uncomfortable realities, in a way that maybe just stating facts can't.
Right. It gets us emotionally involved, makes it impossible to look away.
Totally. But here's where it gets even more interesting. He then flips the script and says that language can be used in the opposite way, too.
You mean to obscure the truth instead of revealing it?
Exactly. He even compares it to something we've probably all experienced. How kids justify stealing.
Oh, that's a good one. I didn't take it. I just, borrowed it.
Exactly. We've all heard those justifications. And he makes this connection between that and the way those in power throughout history have used language to rationalize their actions.
Even the most horrible, unthinkable actions, just cloaked in fancy words.
And one of the most disturbing examples he gives is the historical attempt to write Black people out of the narrative of ancient Egypt.
It's wild. It's like they just couldn't accept the evidence right in front of them. He talks about Samuel Morton, a scientist back in the 19th century who was obsessed with proving Black people were inferior.
And this is a scientist, someone who's supposed to rely on evidence.
I know, but he was so blinded by his prejudice that he even dismissed the Sphinx. I mean, come on, with its obviously African features as some kind of anomaly. He called it an almost solitary example. Like he couldn't wrap his mind around what it actually said about Egyptian civilization.
It's like they twisted language, twisted history to fit this worldview they already had. Evidence be damned.
And that's what's so dangerous about it. These justifications, these attempts to erase entire groups of people, they don't just disappear, They echo through time and continue to affect how we see the world, how we understand race, even today.
And they talk about Frederick Douglass's writing on freedom, the sheer terror of it, the uncertainty, that hope. The author argues that great writing, any kind of writing, clarifies these emotions, connects us to other people's experiences.
This is already making me rethink how I approach stories.
Yeah.
It's not just entertainment, it's engaging with truth.
Absolutely. And the author's trip to Dakar, Senegal, that's where this embrace of discomfort really comes through. This wasn't just a trip, it was a pilgrimage.
Wow. A place packed with meaning, both for him personally and in terms of, this larger historical context. Yeah, and you can't talk about Dakar without talking about that sketch his mother gives him.
Right. The one of his father reading.
Like, even with everything going on, that pursuit of knowledge, it was so central.
Absolutely. It's like this unspoken legacy, this thirst for understanding that gets passed down.
Totally. And it makes you think about access to information, to stories, as its own kind of power. Right.
Absolutely. And the author even talks about how his father, despite, limited formal education, he was incredibly well-read,
Wow.
constantly absorbing information, engaging in these deep conversations. It really sets the stage for the author's own journey to Dakar.
Yeah.
Where he's immediately confronted by the weight of history.
Right. And specifically the legacy of slavery.
Yeah.
Right? And the ways people tried to justify it using, like, so-called science.
Ugh, don't even get me started on that.
He keeps mentioning this term niggerology, which is, just hearing you say it.
I know, it's jarring. It's basically this pseudoscientific field that emerged in the 19th century, and it tried to create this biological basis for racial hierarchy.
So it's not even trying to hide the racism. It's just straight up.
It's insidious. Imagine trying to twist science to uphold something as horrific as slavery.
It's like this dark undercurrent through his whole trip, Even as he's experiencing the vibrancy of Dakar, he's carrying that knowledge with him.
Absolutely. He even describes these incredible street scenes, the energy, the mix of old and new, the resilience of the people.
Yeah, and then he stumbles upon this fabric shop.
Oh, the scene, right. You can practically feel the energy shift in his writing.
Atop the tape. This fabric shop scene is incredible. It's like this perfect microcosm of getting thrown into a new culture.
Exactly, and he doesn't sugarcoat it. He talks about this almost overwhelming wave of emotions he felt arriving there. Joy, dread, even hope. all mixed together.
Like he's finally confronting this image of Africa he's carried with him, but not really knowing how it'll match up to the reality.
It's like those preconceived notions we all have about places, about people. They're challenged when you actually experience things firsthand.
Right. And sometimes those preconceptions, they even catch us off guard. Like he talks about seeing this abandoned exercise equipment, and you might think, okay, what's the big deal?
But for him, it was this trigger.
Exactly. Suddenly he's hit with this waves of internalized racism. Like he's associating this broken down equipment with some kind of inherent dysfunction in Africa, you know?
Which is just, wow, such an honest but tough admission. It makes you realize how sneaky these biases can be, how they can pop up even when you're actively trying to challenge them.
Absolutely. And this internal struggle, it gets even more complicated when he encounters the way race is perceived in Senegal, which is completely different from the U.S.
Talk about a different perspective. He's talking with the Senegalese woman, just chatting, and she tells him that in Senegal, he'd be considered mixed.
Which is so interesting because in America...
Exactly. In America, he's always been seen as simply black. It just goes to show you how much our understanding of race is shaped by where we are, whose lens we're looking through.
It's like the entire chessboard just flipped.
Right.
He completely flips the script on how he's used to thinking about race, about his own identity. Suddenly, the categories he thought were so fixed, they become fluid, influenced by history, by power dynamics, by all these stories cultures tell themselves about who's in and who's out.
And they're honest about feeling uneasy, wrestling with their own ideas about a place that's so important to the Black American experience.
It's like they have expectations, and then reality kind of hits.
Yes. And one thing that stuck with me, they noticed a lot of skin lightening practices in Senegal. It's a small thing, but it speaks to the massive impact of colonialism.
So that internalized oppression, it goes beyond borders.
Exactly. Even in the motherland, that legacy is still there.
Wow. And then...
It really highlights how these constructs of race are not universal. But speaking of powerful stories, his visit to Gorée Island becomes this incredibly pivotal moment in his journey.
Gorée Island. Talk about a place loaded with history. It's like the epicenter of the transatlantic slave trade. It's heavy stuff.
It is, and he doesn't shy away from the emotional weight of it, the sadness, this feeling of connecting to this long, horrific history of suffering. And you can feel the emotional shift in his writing. The sadness, the weight of history, the horrifying realization of where he's standing. The author describes feeling this overwhelming sorrow, being connected to the slave trade. It's not the past, it's present. He even breaks down crying, which, I mean...
It's like, how could you not? Feeling of connection to their ancestors and the weight of that shared history.
It's a lot to carry. And I feel like this experience, this visit to Gorée Island, it brings up this tension that we see the author grappling with throughout their notes.
You're right. That tension between needing to acknowledge and learn from historical injustices, but also this danger of, I don't know, almost getting stuck in the past.
Like it can be all-consuming.
Exactly. And there's this sense that constantly reliving that historical trauma, it can overshadow the present realities of African people.
Their agency, their resilience, their vibrant cultures.
All of it.
It's a tough balance to strike. And I think this is where the author's point about storytelling comes full circle. He realizes that he's been engaging with this romanticized version of Africa, a version that centers on the past instead of connecting with the present.
So how do you bridge that gap?
He starts seeking out contemporary African voices, activists, writers, artists. He even talks about this fire that fuels their words, and it's clear that this connection is vital to him.
It's like that feeling he had in Dakar, realizing he's been engaging with this romanticized version of history, almost like it echoes in how he talks about his own school years.
Totally.
And suddenly those childhood rhymes feel a million miles away.
Right. It's like they're connecting those things, how language and storytelling and oppression are all woven together. It's a lot to think about.
It's like you can't look away from these things no matter how much you want to sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think what's important is that it pushes him to really confront things. His preconceived notions about Africa, about his own identity, all in the face of this brutal past. It's like this journey is forcing him, and in a way, us the readers too, to re-examine everything we thought we knew about history, about ourselves, about how much language shapes those understandings.
And this whole exploration of how language impacts us, it leads him to reflect on something we've all experienced, being a student. And this is where the author brings in their own struggles. With school, you know, they felt like a total outsider, always restless. Later, they figured out it was ADHD.
So many people can relate to that, feeling like you don't fit in, Oh, yeah. He goes there. He talks about those notes from teachers, the ones scrawled in that dreaded red ink. Ta-Nehisi was restless today.
Oh, I can still smell that ink.
I can practically feel the judgment radiating off that page.
It's such a small detail, but it speaks volumes, right? This kid, clearly brilliant, curious, but doesn't quite fit the mold.
Right, and he remembers them saying he was unable to follow directions, like he was somehow deficient, especially in school, where everything's so strict.
Totally. And the author. They did well when they could learn by doing. Science projects, museum trips, that kind of thing.
It makes you wonder how many people were failing because of this one-size-fits-all thing. And he connects this to a bigger issue, too, how the education system often prioritizes conformity over, actually fostering a love of learning. He talks about how much he thrived during field trips, hands-on projects, anything that let him engage with the material in a way that resonated with him, with his way of learning.
Which I think is so important because we don't all learn the same way. A system that only values one type of learner is going to leave a lot of people behind.
Absolutely.
And he even talks about how he felt this pressure from his parents to succeed within that system. They were working hard, trying to provide for him, and he wanted to make them proud, but...
Like the system itself wasn't set up for him to thrive.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how he contrasts that with his experience created this imaginary animal for a science project.
Oh, yeah. Instead of just drawing it, he goes all out, builds this shark out of papier-mâché.
It's such a great example of how his mind works. He needs to experience things firsthand to make knowledge tangible.
Exactly. And it makes his critique of what he calls the banking system of education all the more powerful. This idea that knowledge is something to be deposited, not something to be explored, questioned.
It's about checking boxes instead of sparking curiosity, right? And that brings us to that article he mentions, the one about the earthquake.
The really big one, right, by Catherine Schultz. It's terrifying, but the way she writes about it...
Yeah, he was really geeking out about her writing style.
For good reason. She uses these incredibly vivid descriptions, almost like you're right there, feeling the ground shake. It's a perfect example of how language can move beyond the abstract and make something visceral, real.
And he connects that to the idea of creating safe spaces, particularly when it comes to discussing challenging, even uncomfortable topics.
And there's no better example of that than the story he tells about William Shockley.
Okay, rewind for a second. Shockley, wasn't he that physicist who...
Yeah, he won a Nobel Prize, but he was also incredibly racist, notorious for his views on Black genetic inferiority.
And this professor invites him to speak at a historically Black university. And the fact that he was invited to speak at a university at all is pretty shocking.
It is, but what makes it even more interesting is the context. He's surrounded by Black students, Black professors. So Shockley's ideas, they're not just being presented in a vacuum. They're being actively challenged, refuted.
Exactly.
The author was in this space that was generally supportive, but those ideas, they still hurt. But, and this is key, they pushed back. They refused to be silent.
That's so important. We have to stay aware, even in spaces that feel safe. It becomes this lesson in how important context is, how crucial it is to create spaces where even the most difficult ideas can be discussed, debated, dismantled. I mean, I get wanting to engage with different perspectives. But
it is definitely controversial. But for the author, that experience ended up shaping his entire view on safe spaces.
Because in that environment, surrounded by other Black students and professors, he knew his own humanity wouldn't be questioned.
Exactly, which allowed him to engage with Shockley's ideas, to challenge them head-on, without fear.
It's like that foundation of respect and safety allowed him to lean into the discomfort of those ideas. This leads to the author's love of teaching, making spaces where you can have these tough conversations.
Exactly. And they talk about their writing workshops and how it's not about trigger warnings or avoiding tough stuff. It's about creating that respect, that empathy, so students feel safe enough to engage.
To actually grapple with them.
And that makes his concerns about the backlash against critical race theory even more understandable.
Totally. This push to ban books, to restrict what can be taught about race and racism in schools,
it's about controlling the narrative, silencing those who challenge the status quo. Which makes what he talks about next even more relevant, especially today. He brings up the whole debate about censorship in education.
Specifically, attempts to ban books dealing with race, racism, the stuff that makes some people uncomfortable.
It's like they're trying to create this safe space for one very specific worldview, one that doesn't allow for any questioning, any challenging of the status quo.
It's about controlling the narrative. And he then shares this very personal story about going to a school board meeting A teacher was being targeted for having his book, Between the World and Me, in the curriculum.
I can't imagine being in his shoes. It must have been so intense.
He talks about going into that meeting expecting hostility, ready for a fight, but then something really unexpected happens. He finds allies, people from the community, parents even, who are pushing back against the censorship, defending the right to have these books, these conversations in schools. And it's a powerful reminder that the fight for diverse narratives, for inclusive education, it's not just some abstract idea. It's about real people, often from very different backgrounds, coming together to protect the freedom, to think critically, to engage with different perspectives. Because ultimately, that's what education should be about. And this whole thing about language, about power, about whose stories get told and whose get silenced, it takes the author on another journey.
This time to Israel and Palestine. Right?
Yeah, and it's not just him, observing things as a traveler. This trip really changed how the author sees the world.
Yeah.
He starts drawing these direct lines between how language was used to justify slavery in America.
And how it's being used in the conflict between Israel and Palestine.
Exactly. Like, he's pointing out these parallels between historical justifications for oppression and what's happening right now.
Which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, right? We often see these historical events as separate. But he's showing how those tactics, those ways of using language to dehumanize, to erase, they repeat, they echo across time.
Totally. And one of the most powerful parts of this section is when he talks about visiting Yad Vashem.
The Holocaust Remembrance Center.
Yeah.
The author was floored. The scale of it, the documentation of this genocide, it's a heavy reminder of how much evil humans are capable of.
He doesn't downplay how impactful it was, how confronting that level of horror really makes you question, the depths of human cruelty.
It's heavy stuff.
It is. And he talks about how it shifted something for him, not his understanding of the Holocaust itself, but how that history has been used.
What do you mean?
Like, he grapples with how it's become this shield, in a way. That any criticism of Israeli policies, any attempt to bring up Palestinian suffering is met with accusations of anti-Semitism, of minimizing the Holocaust. It makes it really difficult to have honest conversations.
That's a really good point, because it's not about diminishing one group's suffering to acknowledge another's. And then his experiences traveling in the West Bank, they seem to really drive this home.
Totally. He talks about the settlements, the checkpoints, these restrictions on movement, on daily life.
Yeah. They even mention encountering a smart shooter turret.
I'm going to be honest, I don't fully know what that is. Sounds scary, though.
Basically, it's an AI weapon system, meant to be more accurate, less collateral damage. But for the author, it's this symbol of how technology can be used for control, like automated oppression.
Wow. And that leads him to this encounter with a Palestinian woman named Deanna.
And hearing her story in her own words about the Deir Yassin massacre,
it cuts through all the noise, all the official narratives, and reminds us that there are always multiple sides to every story. And that sometimes the most important thing we can do is just listen, to amplify those voices that are so often silenced. And I think that's something the author does really well. He's challenging us, pushing us to question the stories we've been told, to look for those missing voices, to be willing to confront uncomfortable truths. And that's how we learn, how we grow. That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
So you have Yad Vashem, the horrors of the past, and then this, the reality in the occupied territory.
Yeah.
And it creates this incredible cognitive dissonance.
They're seeing these two things, these two historical narratives existing simultaneously.
And clashing.
Forcing them to confront the limitations of those simple narratives, those binaries we often rely on.
That's rarely that simple.
Especially not in a place like Palestine. So how does the author make sense of this? How do they move forward with this new awareness?
Well, you can really sense this shift in their thinking, this move away from those simplistic explanations towards a much deeper, I think, more nuanced understanding of power dynamics.
And how those dynamics shape our perception of events.
Exactly. And this shift is particularly evident in how they start to question certain terms, labels that maybe they previously accepted without much scrutiny.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, they start putting the phrase Jewish democracy in quotes.
Oh, interesting. They're signaling a growing skepticism about whether that label is truly accurate or inclusive. And I think it shows how they're starting to look beyond the surface, dig deeper into the complexities of the situation.
Right. Questioning the dominant narratives that are often presented as truth.
Yes, and this questioning of narratives, it becomes central to their evolving understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in general. Like,
highlighting the ways that power is used to control and oppress specific groups of people throughout history and across different contexts.
exactly. And it's not just about, these grand, obvious acts of oppression, right? Like, the author seems particularly struck by this concept of dowry, not the bride.
What does that mean?
So they explain it as this idea that Zionist ideology, at least in some interpretations, it often prioritizes control of the land over the rights and the humanity of the people who are already living there.
Is putting the land before the people.
Right. And that really resonated with me.
So it's not just about disagreements over borders or historical claims, but about one group essentially asserting its right to the land at the expense of another.
Yeah, and the author, they encounter this firsthand when they're touring Hebron.
Hebron.
Yeah, with these Israeli guides who had actually participated in enforcing the occupation.
Wow. So they're hearing it directly from the source, so to speak.
Exactly. And what's striking is that it's not just stories about, like, individual acts of prejudice or discrimination.
It's more insidious than that.
Yeah, the author starts to grasp the systematic nature of the occupation.
How it's embedded in everything, the infrastructure, the bureaucracy, even, like you were saying before, the language that's used to describe it.
Right. They specifically talk about how terms like settlements, they sound almost harmless.
When in reality, they represent this process of displacement and dispossession for Palestinians.
It's a reminder of how easily we can be manipulated by the way things are framed,
Absolutely. The author is starting to understand how language itself can be used to mask injustice.
And the author sees parallels between what they're seeing in Palestine and stuff back home, like redlining in America.
Different situations, but similar tactics of control, of keeping people separate.
Right.
And he's like, this feels eerily familiar to Jim Crow. The way systems are built to separate people based on identity, deny basic rights and freedoms.
And that's backed up by this whole narrative that one group is inherently superior, more deserving.
Exactly. Which makes you wonder, have we really learned anything from the past if we're still seeing these patterns repeat? And he's also critical of America's role in this.
Oh, he doesn't hold back. He's very clear that our unwavering support for Israel has allowed a lot of this to continue.
Yeah, he doesn't let us off the hook at all. He even mentions this park he saw, named after Mir Kahan.
Who was that?
He was this rabbi, really extreme, who advocated for expelling all Palestinians from Israel. Like, really disturbing stuff.
Wow. Okay, so we're back to this idea of language being used to justify some really messed up things.
And it's not just, official policies. It's about the stories that take root in a society. He talks about how the whole narrative of Israel as this tiny country, constantly under threat, surrounded by enemies, it creates this justification for viewing Palestinians as the aggressors.
Even though they're the ones who've been dispossessed, right? It's like controlling the story, controlling how people see the situation, allows you to justify almost anything.
He uses the example of this book, Exodus. It was hugely popular, really shaped how people saw Israel. But he argues that it also completely romanticized the whole thing, left out crucial Palestinian perspectives.
So it's a powerful story, but it's also kind of dangerous because it presents a very specific and some might say one-sided view of a very complex situation. He talks about this even when he visits this archaeological site, the City of David. And instead of just seeing old ruins, he sees this narrative being built right in front of him.
Like, they're literally digging up history to support a certain viewpoint. And all ties back into this idea of erasing any Palestinian claim to the land, any history that doesn't fit with this narrative of, solely Jewish ownership, which is just wild because it's such a complex history with so many layers.
And to pretend otherwise, to only tell one side of the story, it doesn't do anyone any favors. And here's where it gets even more complex. The author starts looking at Zionism itself. At first, there was sympathy, shared history of oppression, but seeing it firsthand, those contradictions are hard to ignore.
You mean the whole Jewish democracy that excludes so many people?
Exactly. They actually talked to two Israeli activists, Avner and Guy, who see the problems with the occupation, but they struggle with their own beliefs and what's happening. That conflict, it really gets to you.
It's like you can't unsee it, once you see it. And for the author, that gets even more intense when they learn about the Deir Yassin massacre, this awful event in 1948.
Yeah.
Hundreds of Palestinians killed.
And the author points out it's so close to Yad Vashem, like right there.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you hold these two things, two histories of just unimaginable suffering right next to each other?
It's heavy stuff. The idea that people who have been through such horror can then inflict it on others.
And that brings us back to this idea of erasure, silencing Palestinian voices, their history. That's how a certain narrative stays in place.
The oldest trick in the book. You control the story, you control reality.
Right. And the author talks about how even writers, journalists, they fall into this trap. They write about Palestinians, but they don't let them speak for themselves.
It's subtle, but it's still a form of control.
Totally. And that's why the conversations with Deanna and her family, they're so important. They're Palestinian Americans. And they offer this completely different view, something that challenges the stereotypes we're used to.
It's like they're saying, hey, we're not just numbers. We're real people with real lives.
It's interesting how his own identity factors into all of this, too. He talks about feeling uncomfortable at times, being treated as a black man in Israel. Like he's forced to confront his own blind spots.
Yeah, because even when you've experienced oppression firsthand, it doesn't mean you're immune to having biases. It's like this ongoing work to constantly check yourself to make sure you're not, perpetuating the same harms you've experienced.
Mm-hmm.
So the author is grappling with all of this, the emotional toll of bearing witness to such deeply ingrained injustice. It must feel incredibly heavy.
It does, but there's also this sense that the author is going through this really profound personal transformation. Like they start reflecting on their own views on redemption.
How so?
Well, they talk about moving away from those more idealistic notions of, returning to a mythical past.
Right.
And they're moving towards, I think, a more nuanced understanding of justice and accountability.
It's about letting go of those black and white narratives.
And embracing the complexities.
Because true justice, it requires a much deeper understanding of the historical and systemic forces that are at play.
It's a journey of unlearning and then relearning. And it seems like this really key part of that process for the author, like a turning point almost, is when they start hearing directly from those most affected by the occupation.
Yeah, they weren't just reading about it anymore.
Exactly. Like they talk about this one meeting with Nasser Nawajah.
Who's that?
So he's a Palestinian activist in Susia.
Okay.
And his family had been repeatedly displaced from their land.
Oh, wow.
And I think for the author, hearing these firsthand accounts of how the occupation impacts people's daily lives, well, it just hits differently.
It becomes real, it's not just an abstract concept anymore.
Exactly. And the author, they're also really struck by these stark contrasts, right? Like they describe visiting Tel Aviv.
A modern city. Vibrant.
Right. And then traveling to the West Bank, and it's just a completely different reality. And, throughout these notes, the author is also really wrestling with how history is presented, the narratives used to kind of justify the current situation.
Like, a lot of this is about whose story gets told.
And who gets to tell it. Exactly. And they have this one experience that I think really brings this home for them. They visit the city of David.
Which is often presented as this celebration of Jewish history.
Yes. But it sits on contested land.
Right.
And it's actively displacing Palestinian residents.
It's a perfect example of how history can be weaponized.
To support claims to power, to erase other narratives.
And it makes you question everything,
Totally. Like even those fields that we think of as objective, like archaeology.
They can be manipulated to serve certain agendas.
It's a good reminder to always, always question what we're being told. Even when it comes from, those authority figures, those seemingly objective sources.
Don't just take it at face value.
Exactly. And the author, they keep questioning, keep digging. Like they even meet with this Israeli archaeologist, and even he is questioning the narratives being promoted at the city of David.
Wow. So there's this recognition that even within, Israeli society, there are dissenting voices.
Yes. Multiple perspectives.
It's about acknowledging the diversity of experiences and opinions, even within what might seem like a monolithic group.
And I think this really leads the author to this profound realization, this understanding that their own government, the United States, is also complicit.
In supporting the occupation.
Yeah, and it adds this whole other layer of personal responsibility to everything.
You can't just be a passive observer when you realize your own government is playing a role in these systems of oppression.
It's a call to action for all of us, I think. And for the author, it seems like this realization has a profound impact on how they view their own role as a writer. Well, they talk about how they don't want to just report on events anymore. They want to use their platform to challenge those dominant narratives.
To amplify those voices that are so often silenced.
Exactly. They even talk about their writing as a form of reparation, a way of honoring those stories, those experiences of people who have been marginalized and oppressed. It's been quite a deep dive, hasn't it? That makes you realize how powerful language is, how much it shapes our understanding of the world, for better or for worse.
Exactly. And it all circles back to his point about storytelling, about whose stories are deemed safe, whose are considered dangerous. And it makes his decision to share his experiences in Palestine even more powerful, because he's deliberately stepping into that space of discomfort, of challenging those dominant narratives.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so compelling. It's not just about the specific stories he tells, but about how those stories intersect with these larger questions about power, about race, about whose voices get heard and whose get silenced.
It's a reminder that the stories we tell and the stories we choose to believe, they have the power to shape the world around us.
For better or for worse.
Exactly. So yeah, this deep dive, it's been a journey, but I think it's left us with a lot to think about, to unpack. It's a call to be more critical, more discerning, more willing to listen to those voices that have been marginalized for far too long.
So if there's one thing you take away from today's deep dive, let it be that. Thanks for joining us, everyone.